Recording in progress.
Okay, welcome, and we're on, right? Welcome to the second of two sessions on the Stoics. I want to just briefly review a little bit of what we talked about last time to frame our discussion, and then move into a little more detailed discussion of some of the major Stoics, most particularly, I think, here, Chrysippus, and then the key Roman Stoics, particularly Epicurus and Marcus Aurelius. But so we started by trying to locate the Stoics in their historical context, right? Understanding that Stoicism really emerges in what is often called the Hellenistic and then Roman periods. And that is after the disintegration, or you may say the disappearance of the autonomy of the Greek city-states or polis, following upon the conquest of Greece by the Macedonians, first under Philip of Macedon, most particularly the Battle of Chaeronea in 338, and then following his assassination by his son Alexander, known as Alexander the Great, who then not only took over the Macedonian control of Greece, but expanded to the world empire, actually going as far as the Indus Valley and going as far as North Africa, and really transforming what we understand as the Greek world into what is often called the Hellenistic world. That means a world that brought Greek attitudes, values, beliefs to this wider world, but was influenced by and transformed by the cultures that they dominated. Right? So you have a complicated mixture of Greek philosophy, Greek culture and science, and the cultures that are dominated by them. As that Greek world, then becoming the Hellenistic world, from the end, roughly the end of the 300, more or less before the Common Era, until then, the emergence of Rome as a separate independent source of power and domination, and a new cultural form. So Rome slowly expands from the Italian peninsula until basically it takes over the entire Hellenistic world, most of it, the vast majority of it, certainly around the Mediterranean basin, with around 200 to 100 of the before the Common Era, taking over Athens in 146, really concluding its domination through the Roman civil wars, which pitted ultimately Caesar and then his nephew Octavian who becomes Caesar Augustus, or the Emperor Augustus, who succeeds in defeating the opposition of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. And then that really puts an end to the Roman Republic, which had existed more or less in complicated form from the 500s till technically 31 or 27, when the official establishment of what we now refer to as the Roman Empire. That it continues to exist, of course, in its Western version until the so-called fall of the Roman Empire in 476, and the Roman Empire in its Eastern version into Byzantium, Constantinople, continues on until the Ottoman Turks take Byzantium in 1453. So that's a long history, but that's well beyond the scope of the period of time in which Stoicism emerged, developed, became one of the major worldviews, moral and philosophical views that more or less dominated the intellectual world of that Hellenistic Roman period. There were competing views that emerged also more or less in that period of time that we talked about. There was, of course, the Epicureans. There was the continuation of the Platonic Academy in different versions. And there was the continuation of the Aristotelian Peripatetics. And there was also the development of a school of skeptics, which played a significant role in offering alternative strategies for dealing with the values in living in a world which increasingly had gotten out of control of the average person. And I suggested a similarity or some continuity or similarity, you might say, with that situation and a situation that many people are feeling in the modern world today with the development of globalization, where the political and military forces operate at a level well beyond the capacity of the average individual, such as you and myself, to feel that they have a really effective capacity to influence the direction of our collective lives. And I think that we can say that that's the predominant experience, or one of the predominant experiences of this emerging Hellenistic world, where the Greeks had felt, by and large, in the classical era, as it were, in Athens and Sparta and Corinth and the other city-states, that they were active participants and could make some decisions and have some influence in the politics which affected their community and hence the direction of their collective life. With the domination, successful domination, first of the Macedonians and then of this Alexandrian Empire, which continues on after Alexander's death in numerous versions, which we won't go into here, there was a palpable loss of sense that the average individual could feel that they had an effective role in determining the collective destiny of their communities. So there was an increasing turn toward individual solutions to the meaning and significance of life, or how I should live my life. Not an unreasonable response, not one that we could see. We might explain in part the revival of a kind of modern Stoicism at the present time for a similar kind of reason. And we do see this development of modern Stoicism. You can just go on the web and put in Stoicism, and you'll find many kinds of people out there presenting different versions of Stoicism for the modern world. Well, that's not my major concern here today, but it is relevant, and maybe something to say at the very end of our discussion today. But that was the context of the emergence of Stoicism. And as I said, it begins, and we can locate it very clearly with specific individual, Zeno of Citium, in Athens in the last decade of the 4th century of BCE, before the Common Era. The same time, by the way, that we can locate Epicurus and his formation of the garden in which Epicurus and his followers gathered. And it's also, I think, we can see the transformation of two movements, the Platonists and Aristotelians, which were created earlier on in that century, but internally transform themselves also to increasingly address those kind of immediate and relatively personal more short-term goals as a way of addressing the concerns of a different culture. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, you were talking about that, people were feeling disaffected,
Right.
They didn't have control. And I'm wondering, to what extent did these philosophies, the ones that you mostly covered last week, did they influence governance and politics, democracy, eventual, you know what I mean?
Okay, so you're asking, I'm just repeating your question for people on.
And I apologize for interrupting. Is there anyone who has a BMW silver license plate KTR?
Yeah.
Okay, you are parked by the president's house, and we'll have to have you move your car. So I didn't want to interrupt, but
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind, I'm so sorry. Sorry, Mr. Sprintzen.
Okay. All right. So let me just take your question, just repeat it for the people on Zoom. And you're asking about to what extent these modes of thinking had an influence on politics and governance.
Right.
Right. And we can come to that we will talk about that a little bit. Clearly, the Stoics had a significant influence, more so, I think, than the Epicureans, who are by and large primarily people who are apolitical. Right? It's very, even the very location of the Epicurean garden was outside of the city limits, as it were. And similarly with the skeptics, and increasingly in ambiguous ways also with the Platonist Academy, which became increasingly skeptical in its orientation, as well as the Aristotelians. So the Stoics would be the major ones that have some significant influence, and we'll come to that because it is relevant to our discussion. But what I want to here just emphasize again, in this context, all of these movements and the ones from which they come, the Stoics emerging out of the Cynics, which I haven't really talked about. I mentioned something about them last time. And the Epicureans emerging in some sense out of the Cyrenaics. I won't go into them either. Movements that have some kind of history. These things movements usually don't emerge out of nowhere. They usually have a history. Right? But all of these movements actually look towards Socrates as the image. Socrates as an embodiment of their ideal, though each one reads that ideal differently. And it is interesting, as I mentioned last time, it's not the historical Socrates so much that's at stake here as the Platonic Socrates. And it is a fantastic tribute, you might say, to Plato in the creation of a quasi-mythical being in some sense. The relationship between the historical Socrates and the Plato of the Socrates of the dialogues is a fascinating, interesting question. And in fact, I will be doing a course on this later in the spring. But I think Plato does present a remarkable dramatization and embodiment. And you look at that Socrates and what is it? Well, each one of these movements takes a different aspect of him. I mean, what is it about Socrates? Socrates says, no man knowingly does an evil thing. There's a kind of sense of the rational capacity of the human being to determine their life, right? No evil can befall a good man in this life or in death. Well, that gives you a sense of the fact that in some sense, your well-being is entirely in your power. Certainly that is something which the Stoics and the Epicureans take seriously to heart. Right? And so if you think about what is Socrates as an image, Socrates of the early Platonic dialogues, most particularly Socrates of the Apology, in which he is defending himself before the Athenian trial, which ultimately led to his being put to death. Right? It's fascinating to see how that vision of Socrates, the philosopher, self-critical, distancing himself from conventional beliefs, critical of them, in total control of his own understanding and his fate, with a sense of the remarkable rational capacity that he has to inquire, but has a certain kind of humility, so-called Socratic ignorance, does not claim to know, but does claim to love wisdom and only to be guided by that. And in loving wisdom and only to being guided by that allows him to have confidence that he is in control of his life and that no evil can befall him from without. These image, and you can play out the image of Socrates further, enough for our purposes here, that image in different forms is central to the entire development of all of these Hellenistic philosophies, right? And certainly it is central to the development of Stoicism, right? Right. But we see Stoicism emerging right after, you might say, right after the destruction of Greek autonomy. The city-states continue, right? And they continue to have local politics. Politics continues in the small cities, but the fundamental decisions are no longer being made there. They're being made at the empire level, whether it's the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Syria, right, the Macedonian Empire in the Greek Peninsula and beyond, or elsewhere. Right. So I think that's the context I do want us to have a sense for and appreciate for its significance and potentially for its relevance here, but certainly to help us get a sense of why these theories may have developed and why they may have been so meaningfully employed. Yes.
Were the followers cult-like?
Well, cult-like is a word, you want to ask me whether the followers were cult-like or not, right? And the word cult has all kinds of complicated meanings or insinuations, perhaps. And I would not suggest, we usually think of a cult, we think of people who have lost their rational capacity and in an unthinking and emotional fashion of following some kind of leader or some kind of collective infatuation of sort. I think that's usually the meaning of cult, as separating that from perhaps religion or lifestyle. And I don't think that would be an appropriate way of characterizing the followers, certainly the Stoics, or of the Epicureans, maybe more so of the Epicureans in the sense that they had one founder who set forth the views to which they adhered, and there was much less internal development and criticism of the mode of thinking and the values and beliefs of the Epicureans than there was in the Stoics, or in the Platonists or the Aristotelians. So within the Stoics, there is a movement, a development. There are leaders. They are chosen. They are selected leaders of their movement, right? And these leaders, but they don't all agree with each other on all these issues. There's an intelligent, rational analysis and discussion and critical analysis with respect to understanding the world as they understand it. So they have a frame of reference within which they operate. And it's important here, the central importance here is for Chrysippus, who really systematizes in many ways the Stoic worldview. And that frame of theory that Chrysippus develops, which is difficult for us to recapture because he wrote 705 texts. We don't with remarkable titles, with tremendous emphasis on physics and logic, and we don't have any of them. We have excerpts, several hundred excerpts of different versions, different locations, but we don't have any of the original texts. And yet it is his mode of thinking which remains fundamental. And we come to Epictetus. We'll see that Epictetus is really just playing out in many ways and applying the Chrysippus worldview. And the similar also then with Marcus Aurelius. So yes.
But there's always a division between the literati and the populace.
Right.
And
Well, yeah. Well, there's a difference between literati, yes, between those who are educated and those who are not.
yeah, so
Basically, the vast majority of people are not educated.
how are they communicating these messages to the individuals who were not
Yeah.
educated?
Yeah, I would not want to suggest that these modes of thinking that we're talking about were widely dispersed among the average populace.
Okay.
I mean, continuing on in the daily life of the people, I do not know how and to what extent the philosophical views and the lifestyles that are developed here really influenced vast numbers of people who I think went about their daily business more or less following the traditional religious beliefs and practices. And then we certainly see in the Roman world, right, an emergence of all kinds of different forms of mystic religions and practices, ultimately, which the one that wins is Christianity, right? Which was in some sense influenced by Stoicism, but really, we shouldn't think of these as movements which had profound influence on the vast majority of people, except insofar as influenced the leaders in different ways, and I think more in the Stoic context in the Roman world than elsewhere, because they did have some influence on Stoic politics. By and large, the vast majority of people probably went on with their daily life precisely as they did, and knew very little, I would assume, about these different philosophical and lifestyle positions and points of view. They're really much more for the relatively educated people, and that difference continues as you look at the analysis of the election today in the United States. You find the question of educated levels is one of the most significant distinctions as to people's political orientations. So that's not unique to that period of time. So, but I don't think I don't believe that the vast majority of people will be influenced significantly by most of these thoughts. Right. So now, if we to think then about the development of Stoicism, right? And I said it really begins pretty clearly with Zeno of Citium, but the real theoretical foundation and systematization of it was developed by Chrysippus, the third of the leaders of the school of Stoicism. Zeno and Cleanthes, and last time I referenced and read briefly from Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus, which is one of the few works we do have, actually, perhaps the only complete work we have from the early Stoa. And then the third scholarch, leader of the school of the Stoics, was Chrysippus, who dies around 206 roughly. I'm not sure the exact date, so you get a sense of when he was ruling the Stoic world, from maybe 232 or so to 206 roughly. I'm not sure, about those dates. And this sadness, in some sense, as I said last time, and also the brilliance that scholars have been able to recapture much of this through extensive work and analysis, but the sadness of how much is lost, how much of the great Greek and Roman worlds have lost. And it's sometimes it is a matter of chance, to some extent, why documents get copied. I mean, nothing is going to last this 2,000 plus years, right? So it only lasts insofar it is, in some sense, it is copied. And they didn't have electronic devices. They didn't have photocopiers. So we're talking about copying. We're talking about copying by hand with quill, right? With ink, right? Or, and on parchment before papyrus, for example, right? Which comes only from killing sheep and then trying to clean up the skins. It's not an easy process. So the fact that we have any of this stuff in some sense is astounding, and yet how much is lost is also sad and astounding. But as I said, Chrysippus we know him to have written, because we have the titles of 705 works, but we have none of them, right? Except excerpts, small excerpts in different places that have been found, or paraphrases in other texts, which allow us to more or less recreate a worldview. So let me say a little bit about the Chrysippin worldview, and it's only a rough overview here, but it frames the discussion, and it is relevant, as we'll see when we get to the more clear practical applications. I pointed out that Stoicism is usually understood in terms of three phases: the early Stoa, the middle Stoa, and the late Stoa. The early Stoa being generated in Greece with first Zeno, then Cleanthes, and then Chrysippus, and there are a few others. And that really goes down to the middle of the 2nd century. And there's a slow transformation. You might say it's a effort to try and make these theoretical views that were developed by these initial scholarchs, and the perfectionism in their moral demands, which to make them more appealing to the populace at large. Going back to your question, is that they try to reach out to a larger group of people to be more appealing, to offer help, not just to the relatively few who can aspire to a more ideal and more perfect way of living, but to a wider group of people who can benefit in their daily life, even if they do not live up to the ideals. That happens within the context of what is often known as the middle Stoa, the key figures being Panatius and Posidonius. I won't go into them details now. That is a process also by which what is essentially a Greek mode of thinking in the Greek language is slowly modified to address a very different culture, the Roman culture, a culture much less theoretical, much more practically oriented. The Romans are known, what are the Romans known for? They're known for law, they're known for building remarkable, aqueducts, right? Highways, right? They're built primarily for to facilitate military control, but remarkable construction, right? So and for remarkable disciplined military force, right? And with a kind of perseverance, and all of this is embodied somehow in the Aeneid, right? But Virgil's Aeneid, where the sense of the commitment to duty and to doing what one must do, and the refusal to failure to fulfill one's responsibilities and obligations. So you could beat the Romans in a battle, but you almost invariably ended up with a Pyrrhic victory. And that refers to a specific war and a specific leader, Pyrrhus, who won, and his victories against the Romans was so painful and destructive that it destroyed him. And the Romans had this capacity for endurance and for perseverance and for military organization and for success. And they did. But they were not theoreticians. They didn't have the flights of imagination, the artistic creativity that the Greeks exemplified in their architecture, in the Parthenon, in the great sculptures. So Roman sculptures are to a large extent copies of Greek sculptures. Roman gods are in some sense appropriations of Greek gods. Zeus becomes Jupiter. Aphrodite becomes Venus, and so forth and so on. So Horace has that famous expression, I don't have the exact words correctly, but basically, captured Greece, captured Rome, right? I mean, in the sense that Greece was captured, was militarily, politically dominated, became subservient. But Greek culture, in some sense, captured the Roman world. And, in the second and first century before the Common Era, you went to Athens the way 19th century Americans went to Germany to study, right? Because Athens remained the center of intellectual activity. That's where Cicero went and studied under Posidonius in Athens in 77 to 78 before the Common Era. So there was that intertwining, as it were, of these cultures, right? But Greek culture and then Greek language. In order to carry out philosophy, basically you had to learn and speak Greek. So Posidonius and Panatius, they're writing in Greek. In fact, even into the second century of the Common Era, right, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations are written in Greek. I mean, he's the Roman emperor, but he's writing to himself in his notes in Greek. There was an effort. Cicero actually leads the effort of trying to Latinize Greek philosophy. And many of the words that we use in philosophy, such as anima for soul, is Cicero's version of the Greek word psyche. Right? And there are many others without going into detail. There's an effort, but the Latin language was really not as flexible and not as adequate and appropriate for the development of sophisticated philosophical ideas as the Greek language was. But by and large, all of the people in the Stoic movement are writing in Greek, with a couple of key exceptions. Cicero, who was not a Stoic, but sympathetic to the Stoics, and from whom we get a lot of the paraphrases, as it were, of Stoic texts. He was a moderate skeptic, but sympathetic to the Stoics. I did write in Latin. And Seneca writes in Latin. And part of the reason why Seneca and Cicero are among the most influential people in Western civilization of Hellenistic thought is because they were accessible. For example, with the rebirth of what we call the Renaissance in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century in Europe, particularly initially in Italy, they looked to Seneca and they looked to Cicero because they couldn't really read Greek, but these people, beautiful stylists in Latin was available. Yeah. So Seneca actually does write in Latin for a public to be for the public to read, and that suggests an effort to have a wider audience. Right? Slowly, as the Roman Empire proceeds and as it increasingly experiences cultural and political difficulties, the importance and significance of Greek and the Greek language and the number of people who know and understand Greek fades out. And you really have a big divide where Greek is the language of the Byzantine Empire. But by the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era, no one in the West any longer really knows Greek, or practically no one, it's gone. And one of the big events in the development of Western civilization, the revival of the Renaissance, was the effort to bring Greek scholars to the West to teach Greek, beginning in the end of the 14th century. Yes?
I read recently that when the Ottoman Empire conquered Byzantium,
Yeah.
that a lot of the people left.
Yes,
And where did
absolutely.
they go? They went to Europe.
Absolutely. Yes.
And
When
brought Greek thinking and some of the writings that were preserved during the early Renaissance.
absolutely. Yes. As not just when the Ottomans captured Constantinople in 1483, but in the years leading up to it, where it became increasingly tenuous to hold on.
Yeah.
There was increasing movement of people fleeing Byzantium and coming to the West. I think the first person who was actually paid to come to Florence to teach Greek, I think it was Manuel Casset. I can't pronounce his name. It was 1394, right? And it was a specific effort to bring him to begin to teach Greek. So people like, I mean, the revival of in the Renaissance, which also involves, by the way, as a sub-movement, a revival of what they often called then Neo-Stoicism, which they developed in that period of time. But there was an effort to recapture classical learning, most led by people such as Petrarch and Boccaccio. And I mentioned last time the recent book, which on the bestseller list, it was called, keep skipping my mind, when the discovery of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things. Oh, why can't I forget the title of that book? It just skips my mind. It's a brilliant book, and it talks about the whole experience of the Renaissance humanists, basically Italian humanists initially, right, seeking to find these lost manuscripts, many of them, squirreled away in the attics of monasteries all over Central Europe, and recapture them. And then the success that Poggio Bracciolini achieved in 1417, I believe. 1417? I get the date right? I believe so. Yeah. And when he came across the manuscript for the only copy available, that was still available someplace, copied by somebody, Lucretius is On the Nature of Things. And then the whole experience of that. It's a brilliant book by, I think it was Stephen Greenberg, and it's written which is a sort of like a detective story, beautifully written, and you get a real sense of the whole effort to of what does it mean to have been born into a period of time in which you feel, you look around at these ruins of what was once a great civilization, and you're living in depressed, poor, culturally, almost like a cultural desert, and seeking to recapture something which has been lost. And you have shards of or pieces of brilliance, and you maybe have a text of Cicero or of Seneca, or maybe excerpts from from Plato. Well, in this case, by that time they had some manuscripts of Aristotle, which had been recapped, which had come back to the West by way of the Arab world in the 11th and 12th centuries, and then entering into the West as part of an earlier preliminary Renaissance, you might say, the rebirth of the 11th and 12th century. And you know that there was something there which we don't have, and trying to recapture that, right? And so we're actually going to search for these lost manuscripts, right? It's called The Swerve, by the way, the title of the book, which relates to The Swerve. I believe that's the title of it, because that relates to a specific notion and how in a materialistic universe, one can't have free will because the atoms somehow instantaneously swerve. That's Epicurus's interpretation of Democritus's atomism. We don't have to get into it. That's for, if we were doing a course in Epicureanism, but it's a brilliant book, and you really would enjoy reading it. And it was really nicely written. Anyway, back to the ranch here. Chrysippus then is deeply rooted in the classical tradition. So he has certainly the text of Plato and the classical tradition. The Aristotelian stuff was not really available, and Aristotle does not play a significant role as far as we can figure in the development of Stoicism, because Aristotle, the stuff that Aristotle wrote, you might say for public reading, has all been lost. He was supposed to have been, and the ancients report him to have been, a brilliant stylist, having written dialogues. We have none of them, right? All we have are probably either his lecture notes or the notes of students from class, so we don't really quite know. And they are not really always systematic or coherent in their structure. And they were not really publicly available in the ancient world after Aristotle. They existed within the context of the Aristotelian community, the Lyceum, the Peripatetic movement, but they weren't publicly available. It's not even clear how much of the members, the followers of Aristotle really knew and read his stuff. And it wasn't until the 1st century before the Common Era that they were gathered together and put into an ordered fashion. And it's only then and somewhat thereafter that they begin to become potentially available, but they really aren't available in the West. Right? It's only Plato that's really available and plays a significant role. And by the way, Plato's thought plays a significant role in the development of Christian thought, most particularly in the full development in St. Augustine, who dies in 430. And Augustine really incorporates his understanding of Plato by way of what is often called Neoplatonism. I won't go into that details, but plays a crucial role. And Aristotle only becomes significant, begins to become significant in the end, toward the end of the 11th, maybe in the 12th century, when his writings have been preserved in the Islamic world, translated from Greek into Arabic, and then slowly translated from Arabic, usually by way of Arabic, back into Latin. The translation from Greek to Latin direct doesn't happen until years later. And when Aristotle then comes into the West, that's part of a kind of philosophical reawakening, which leads to the development of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And that becomes, first Aquinas is put on the index, and then 50 years later, more or less oversimplifying, he becomes the official philosopher of Catholicism and has remained such to the present day, more or less. So if you're a member of the Roman Catholic Church, your way of thinking of the world is basically Thomistic. That means the thought of Thomas Aquinas, and what that is the merging of Christian thought and Aristotle. But that happens only in the 13th century. St. Thomas dies in 1275, I believe. So Aristotelianism, Aristotle is really not really available to the vast majority of people. Plato is in a modified version. All right, but back now to Chrysippus. Chrysippus is part of this intellectual world. Chrysippus develops a logic, a propositional logic, which the people in the ancient world thought was the equivalent of Aristotle's. It gets lost. And propositional logic is only rediscovered and redeveloped in the last part of the 19th century, with no direct relevance from Chrysippus. Right? It's a kind of sadness in some sense that a person who develops an entirely brilliant alternative version of logic, Aristotle's is a logic of terms. You know, to make this point simple, it's just, you know, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. That's a classic example of an Aristotelian syllogism, but this is based on terms linked in a proposition. Right? It's not, so that's the logic which dominates Western civilization until the 20th century, as opposed to the symbolic logic developed in the late 19th, 20th century, which in some sense is something that Chrysippus was so brilliant as to begin to develop, but it's all lost. So, but I say that only from the point of view, therefore, to appreciating that this was obviously intellect of the first order, right? And we maybe can't appreciate the full development of it, but that establishes the structure of the Stoic worldview. And what is central here for our understanding, right, is that what Chrysippus offers is a view which links a conception of nature, physis in the Greek, right, from which we get our word physics, right? But nature is more their view of nature is more biologically rooted. It's more a dynamic growth process. So our images of the natural world now are primarily what can I say? They're not biological fundamentally. They are physical, you might say. They are
Physics.
chemical, physics. And when we say physics, we think really of, matter in motion, right? As opposed to the biological, of things growing and developing. When Aristotle talks about physis, when the Greeks talk about it, or when Chrysippus talks about it, the natural world is in some sense alive. And that's very important for the Greeks right through, for the Stoics. Because in some sense, the universe is alive. It is material, but it is a material impregnated with reason, with rationality. It is dynamic. It is not passive. See, it's important to see that Chrysippus picks up on a vision really of the natural world. It really comes from Heraclitus. We talk about what is the world made of? Well, the classic notion at that time was earth, air, fire, and water, right? There was a competing notion. Obviously, Democritus said the world is made of atoms in the void, but that was not a very popular notion, except for the Epicureans, and it's one of the reasons why Epicureanism always got a bad name, because that was seen as atheism primarily, and it certainly did not speak to any human need for a world with which one can personally relate. One cannot establish an emotional relationship to atoms in the void, right? That's an emotional problem. It may not be a rationally legitimate reason to reject it, but it is certainly an emotionally significant one, why it would not appeal as much, right? I mean, the religions that appealed and the philosophies that appealed need to speak in some sense to human beings' emotional capacities. Christianity clearly does, identifying, right, with a God who becomes human and suffers and dies in order to. You can make it's meant as a personal relation. You can relate to the individual, and it's offering a personal salvation. Atoms in the void don't offer personal salvation. They don't speak to you emotionally, right? So there are complications and difficulties, right? But the Stoic view is a little more ambiguous than that, because their conception of the natural world, highly sophisticated and developed, is really of the world as a kind of living being. It's material, but it's not material in our sense of the word material, right? It's living. It's a sense of in which this is it's like a living being with a soul. The soul is soul. It's often the wrong word to use again, the soul, right? Because that word is Christian for us. I mean, when we say soul, we can't help it. We don't have to be. You don't have to be particularly Christian to have it mean that that's the way the word has come to mean. But the word anima, or the word psyche, that didn't mean what we mean by soul. It's more. If it means anything, it means living thing. Anima is that which animates the body, right? Which is animate, but not as something separate from the body. Right? That's the Christian sense, and the Christian sense has there are prior ways of thinking which spoke that way, such as the Pythagoreans, which we'll get involved in, the separation of the soul and the body. But basically, the Greeks didn't think that way. Hey, the ancient Hebrews didn't. I mean, there's no soul in the Old Testament any more than there's an afterlife. Right? It's very different. It's really, they don't really, the Old Testament really doesn't have a developed metaphysics here. All right, it's an ambiguous concept there. But basically, it's a natural world. It's a natural world with, depending on your time frame in history, a father-like figure who somehow shapes the world, didn't create it out of nothing. That's a Christian notion, not a Jewish notion. Right? There's a chaos there. That means there is a lot of unorganized stuff, very similar to what Plato does also with the Timaeus. You got unorganized stuff. It's like a potter who takes the clay and shapes it into, that's the best image, by the way. It's the image of that you get in Plato's Timaeus. That's the image that undergirds the development of Neoplatonism. It's the image which undergirds the development of Christianity theoretically. But Christianity then appropriates the notion of creation out of nothing. Well, Greeks don't understand that. Romans don't understand. What does that mean? What do you mean creation out of nothing? All right, well, that's another story for another time. But that's not for the Stoics. For the Stoics, matter, which is alive and dynamic, is really, it's really organized energy, but it is organized energy which has a structure to it, which has a rationale behind it. Now, it's difficult for us to understand that, but it's what we would think of when we think of the human being animated by a purposeful, dynamic, you might say genetically determined structure. Right? Remember, genes are material things, and in some sense, they are guiding and structuring the development of other material things, right? If you think about it, right? That's just in a very practical sense. All right, well, now we can think about that and we take a step back and say, wait a second, well, maybe genes aren't the way Chrysippus thought about it. How did he think of the material, the part of material, which is the force that guides and directs? Well, he thought about it as, in some sense, as fire, because fire is dynamic, it's material, it's energetic, it's energy. Yeah, there's a difficulty to reach the level of theoretical abstraction by which we can form the notion of energy. Right? Fire is a material embodiment, you might say, of an abstract notion. Well, Heraclitus or Chrysippus didn't develop the abstract notion of energy. By the way, I suspect you'd have difficulty figuring out what that notion is. I mean, what do we say by energy? Energy is the capacity to do work. Oh, that's interesting. Wait a second. What is it? You know, tell me what it does, but what is it? Well, it's not so clear what it is. Okay? It's not so clear that we can develop an easy, abstract conception of the notion of energy. We know what it does. You know, it's a little bit like Newton used to say, I don't know how gravity works. All right? I don't frame any hypothesis. I don't understand how there's an instantaneous action at a distance and how the moon can affect, the sun can affect the earth instantaneously, as gravity is supposed to do. All I know is I can write the equations and it describes it. Okay, well, that's good, but what is it? Well, of course, Newton didn't know, and he said, I don't know. I don't frame hypotheses. But we have more developed theories now, and I won't go into Einsteinian discussion of curved space-time, and don't expect me to try to explain that anyway. But so if we're thinking about it, if we think about what Chrysippus is doing, all right, he's picking up a notion that the world is made of earth, air, fire, and water, but that this earth, air, fire, and water has a coherent, organized structure. There are elements of that, namely primarily the fire, which is really an energy which is coherent, which is purposeful, which guides and directs the rest of the material stuff. It's called the logos. The logos is the fire. What, in the practical sense, he uses the word pneuma, which means breath. Right? Not unlike, by the way, the Bible, right? God breathes the breath, in breath into the human being. Right? So the notion of life being linked to breath is not unique to the Stoics. You can see it if you do yoga practice, right? The importance of breath, right? It's not or you can say, what is the Holy Spirit? Well, in some sense, the word is really close to breath, right? It brings things alive. So there's this sense that there's something at work in the natural world, which is rational, purposeful, forceful, which guides and directs the rest of the material in a coherent fashion. right? And we, all of us, are simply part of that. So for the Stoics, the human being is part and parcel of the natural world. There is a structure to that world, and there's a structure to our human being. There's our place in it. We have a place in this world. We have a nature. It's a nature designed by and created by this dynamic logos process, which is providential, coherent, directed. And what is it? How are we to behave? Well, in first place, that process is natural, and from Chrysippus' point of view, it is entirely material, but it's material in the sense that it's a living being with a coherent, rational structure to it and direction and a nature. But it is a process which is deterministic, because events have causes, and previous events have causes, and there's a chain of causality, but that's structured. That's the way it has to be. There's a necessity here. So the natural world is causally determined to function as it is. It's not in our control. Of course, he's got a problem. Of course, he wants to be able to say yes, but we can somehow influence our behavior and action. So at the same time as he has a conception of the natural world, entirely materialistic, but again, not materialistic in our reductionist sense of modern physics, but materialistic in the sense of a living being, right, with a rational purpose, a rational energetic purpose, directing it, right? At the same time, we as part of that are both determined by that world of which we're a part. But we have a will capable of determining our interpretation of what happens. We can interpret what happens, and we can determine whether or not what we choose to do about it. Yes.
You get to the point, what is rational?
What is rational? You're saying it's a question. What is rational?
Yeah, what's rational to someone or some ideology might not be.
What is rational in part is, I think the answer to that, at least in the context of our discussion here, and there are much more complicated, sophisticated discussions we could have about the contemporary world and how we understand that, is basically that which is systematically, logically coherent, and consistent with the worldview that is articulated. So it becomes relatively clear, right? I mean, what is rational is that which follows in accordance with the structure of the natural world and of our place in it, and is consistent logically. And I mean, Chrysippus is a good example of this because he was such a brilliant logician. So there is a sense of what constitutes logically coherent, right? So logically coherent, then it depends, well, what's your starting point? Because you have the right starting point, and the logical coherence, you have a guaranteed result. That's the very notion of truth and validity and truth in a logical sense. So that's, I think, for our purposes, we could say that which is logically coherent within the framework of the world as Chrysippus understands it, or as the Stoics in general. And I'm using Chrysippus because it was said of him, for example, I think it's Sextus Empiricus, no, Diogenes Laertius, who says this in his Lives of the Great Philosophers, were there not a Chrysippus, there would not have been a Stoa. Meaning that if it was not for his systematization of the Stoic worldview, it would not have had its historical significance and long life. And it lived clearly as a major force for 500 years. It's not insignificant. And slowly, as I said, it pretty well died out as a major force with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 of the Common Era. And that's an interesting story as to why that happened, and more or less was replaced more or less by mystic religions and by Neoplatonism, which we haven't gone into, and ultimately, of course, by Christianity by the fourth century, right? From Constantine and 312, 325 to the end of the fourth century. By the end of the fourth century, it was the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that meant also of the Byzantine Empire. Though to this current day, there's a profound difference between Greek Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism, and that schism goes back to the 11th century. We won't get involved in that here. So it's a good question, and there are really complicated things to say about rationality and coherence, but in the context of Chrysippus, it's relatively clear. So what we got is this vision then of a living being with a rational, providential, right? It's not a human being, not a personal God that you can relate to as a Christian would have, right? So it's a God or gods, and he would use the words interchangeably. And Chrysippus was quite comfortable, seeing all the Greek gods, or, well, there was no Roman gods really then so much. Well, not really. But there were, but basically the Greek gods as different versions of the same fundamental divine, let's call it a divine force at work in the world. And that's the logos at work. The logos being metaphysically expressed as pneuma, that fiery breath, which is the force that shapes the material world in a coherent direction. Right. So that's that, but at the same time, that fiery breath is also the rational capacity that operates within our minds. The logos of the world is also the logos in ourselves. In part, each of us has part of that logos operating. It's not unsimilar. You can think of certain similarities in Hinduism about the Atman and the relation between Atman and Brahman. Without, there's certain sense, it's a similar kind of thinking there. Right? So there, the logos is at work in us, the rational capacity. And what you get there, and this is really important, and I'm going to conclude this discussion of Chrysippus, not because it does justice to Chrysippus, but because I want to go on and spend some time talking about the really day-to-day, you might say, practical application of Stoicism as it found an expression in the Roman world in the Common Era, basically. And most particularly, that means Seneca. It could be Musonius Rufus. I won't talk about him, who was since Epictetus' teacher. Then Epictetus, most particularly, I'm going to talk about in Marcus Aurelius. Right? So let me bring that, therefore, to a conclusion with what is so brilliant here with Chrysippus is, for the first time, you really have, I think it's the first time, you really have a sense of that human beings have this part of the divine in them, right? This rational capacity, the logos, our reasoning capacity, which separates us totally from all other creatures. And the Stoics really draw a really clear line, maybe too clear a line, between human beings and the animal world, right? That may be, that's an issue, but in so doing, what they are really doing is celebrating the rational capacity of human beings and saying that all human beings deserve to be treated with dignity and respect because they have the divine within them. That sense of the universal respect, not just for Greeks versus barbarians, right? Or Israelis versus Palestinians, whoever you want to say, but all human beings, right? That is, I think, unique in the world. I think it is. It may or may not be. I leave it for you to think about, but it is in principle intrinsic to the Stoic worldview, right? The Stoic worldview. But they may not have organized actively to put an end to slavery and to treat women as equally as men. But Musonius Rufus is quite clear, for example, that women have the same reasoning capacity as men and should have the right to be trained as Stoics. Right? right? I wouldn't say that the Stoics were a mobilized, organized insurgency. They weren't. That's just not the way they understood themselves in their place in the world. We'll say more about that in a bit. Right? But I mean, Epictetus was quite comfortable teaching women as well as men, as was Musonius Rufus, is quite explicit on that. Zeno, the founder, is supposed to have said in his Republic, which we don't have, we only have reports of it, that women and men should wear about the same clothes, so to be sure so they wouldn't make any gender distinctions. Right? And that's Zeno. That's 300 BCE or thereabouts. I mean, I'm not trying to make them as radical feminists here. They're not. Okay, and without getting carried away. I mean, and of course, Epictetus was a slave. There's no reason, he was freed. He was a slave. He was freed, and you can see it with Marcus Aurelius too. It's a tremendous sense in the Stoics of what it requires for us to be free. The whole discussion of Stoicism and Stoic ethics is how to be free from the illusions and conventionalities of the majority of people who don't know what really matters. And when we use the word virtue, as the Stoics said, it's again so misleading. I mean, we're followers of 19th century Victorian morality or something. Virtue means somehow, not having sex before marriage or, whatever, that's sort of out of date these days anyway. But I mean, that's not what we meant. First place, the word virtue actually is in Latin. It meant manliness, right? If you go back there, you read the virtues in Machiavelli. He's obviously not talking about the Victorian morality when Machiavelli uses virtue, but it's really a poor translation of the Greek. Right? What they really mean is we have a nature, whatever you understand the nature to be, and obviously the Stoics have a conception of nature. And of our nature. And we should live in accordance with our nature. What is in our best interest? What is it which our nature requires to fulfill itself? And the Stoics are, the Greek word is eudaimonia, right, which basically means, in some sense, having good fortune or having a good daemon looking after you, being a kind of God, divine figure, but it's usually translated as well-being or living a flourishing life, living well. So the aim of the Stoics, just like of Aristotle, obviously the application is different, is to live well. And to live well means to live by fulfilling your nature. So when they talk about virtue, they're not meaning, that what we usually mean by being moral in our sense. They mean, living in accordance with your nature and doing that which leaves your nature free of the implications and obligations and responsibilities of others. And it's really important. I mean, the beginning of the manual by Epictetus's manual, you really get the sense very simply. He says, of things, some are in our power and others are not. In our power are opinion, movement toward a thing, desire, aversion, turning from a thing, and in a word, whatever are our own acts. Not in our power are the body, property, reputation, offices, magisterial power, and in a word, whatever are not our own acts. And the things in our power are by nature free, not subject to restraint nor hindrance, but the things not in our power are weak, slavish, subject to restraint in the power of others. Remember then that if you think the things which are by nature slavish to be free, and the things which are in the power of others to be your own, you will be hindered, you will lament, you will be disturbed, you will blame both gods and men. But if you think that only which is in your own, and if you think that what is another's Well, if you think that only which is your own to be your own, and if you think that what is another's as it really is belongs to another, no man will ever compel you, no man will hinder you, you will never blame any man, you will accuse no man, you will do nothing involuntarily against your will, no man will harm you, you will have no enemy, for you will not suffer any harm. That's the vision of Epicurus, drawing out of this sense of what it means to know your nature and to live in accordance with it. We might debate that interpretation. That's fair enough. But using the word virtue tends to be misleading. The same way as using the word nature or soul tends to be misleading. So I think that you have some sense of this worldview, the providential worldview, entirely materialistic, and yet providentially organized and structured, of which we are a natural part, in which we are to find our place in that world. And that fulfills that will make us happy, which allows us to fulfill our nature and our capacities, understanding ourselves as having a divinely ordered place in the natural world and in the social world, because part of our nature is to be social beings. That's so essential for the Stoics. That leads back to the question you raised before. I mean, this is why Stoicism would have a political dimension the way Epicureanism does not, because for Stoics, to understand our nature is to understand that we're part of the cosmos. Right? They developed, as I said last time, some of the things that develop out of Stoicism. One is this cosmopolitanism. It follows from the fact that rational nature is divine, and all beings, all human beings, are deserving of dignity and respect, and they are all, in some sense, fellow members of the same polis, the cosmos polos. They are cosmopolitan. In some fundamental sense, our fundamental allegiance is not to town, village, city, state, nation. It's to humanity. It is to the polis of human beings. That's the vision. That's the vision that in strange, interesting ways, which we'll see in a moment, perhaps, the Roman emperor tries to live by. He's in charge of the Roman Empire, and yet he's trying to live in terms of the notion of himself as a rational being responsible to the cosmos. Yes.
But as an emperor,
Yes.
above, and as a leader, so he really isn't, equal.
Well, he isn't, and he is, I guess, right? Huh? So I'm going to skip over. The time is running short here, and I want to give you. This is, Marcus basically. Epictetus. Let me simplify. I've talked about Chrysippus and the worldview. All right. Basically, Epictetus, who knew Chrysippus, I suspect that he had most of the texts available at that time. How far he's, what is he, 200 years, 250 years after Chrysippus, some period of time, but the material was basically there, I believe, as far as we know. Basically seems to operate within the Chrysipian worldview. His focus is not so much on nature. Remember, Chrysippus's vision of the Stoic worldview that I've described has three basic parts to it: physis, logos, ethos. Right? Basically, the ethos being how morally we should live our lives is the practical application of the logos at work in nature. So it's nature sets the framework, the logical structure of that, and the rational structure of that. I shouldn't even use the word logical because, again, it has a contemporary meaning. The rational structure, the providential rational structure of the natural world, is that which guides how we ought to behave. Okay. And that's why, as I mentioned last time, what comes out of this is both the cosmopolitan vision, as we said, the whole notion of a natural law, less naturality. The natural law is the rational structure that is morally binding on all people. And that natural law theory has played such a significant role in Western civilization. And I mentioned last time, one clear example, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Right? It's basically an articulation of a certain version of natural law, right? Which plays a significant role to the current day. And that's systematized somewhat by Cicero, but is really rooted in the Stoic worldview. We can see its origin to some extent in Aristotle and Plato, but really developed by the Stoics and presented in a way that be Latinized, you might say, by Cicero. And from the political point of view, finding articulation politically in the Roman world in terms of jus civile and jus gentium. That's civil law and the law of all peoples. That's the basis of Roman law, which is rooted in and to be justified by the natural law, which is the framework, and developed systematically. I mean, in the Christian version by St. Thomas Aquinas on different kinds of divine law and positive law, etc. So that's part of the development that comes out of the Stoics, and part of that also is that law is not external. It's not a law out there to which, like the 10 Commandments. It's a law that's out there because it's in here. It is the structure of the rationality of the universe, which is the rationality of the human being. It's intrinsic. So it is therefore, it is incumbent upon us to fulfill our nature, to fulfill our obligations and responsibilities in accordance with what it means to be a rational being in the cosmos. That means that law internally articulates our duty or obligation, what we are to do. The notion of duty or obligation, the importance of doing what is right, is developed by Stoics for the first time in Western history. It becomes central to Christianity, clearly. Right? That notion, which in philosophical terms it gets developed as deontological ethics, of whom the most complicated, comprehensive development and systematic development of it is in the Ethics of Immanuel Kant of the late 18th century. All right. But that's a moral view which puts at the front one's moral obligation to do what is right, regardless of the consequences. The usual alternative is the consequentialist ethics, which is the ethics generally associated with utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill, which, by the way, is the course I'll be teaching in December on John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, which is the general alternative. The third major moral framework, ethical framework in the Western tradition, besides the utilitarian consequentialism or the deontological emphasis of Kant on duty and right, which has its roots here, as you can see in part in the Stoics. The third one is usually a virtue ethics, an ethics which emphasizes the development of character, and that really tends to be rooted in Aristotle. Right, so if you want to oversimplify a complicated tradition of Western ethical theory, those are the three major thematics. So I was suggesting some of the things that were significant historically that were contributed by this Chrysipian framework of Stoic views, right? But I want to give you the way you mentioned the emperor and the complications. So I wanted to use as the way of sort of bringing this discussion to a close, to see that that structure that we mentioned of physis, logos, ethos, the natural world, the rational structure built into the natural world, and the ethical obligations and responsibilities dictated by that rational structure, which means that what you need to do, your obligation to yourself, your obligation to your other human beings, your obligation to all human beings, the ultimate obligation to the cosmos itself, is to live according to your nature, which is part and parcel of the providential natural world. That's the whole framework. That's the moral framework. And what that means then is to be in control of your life. To do, all right. I want to now. So that framework, right, is then is taken over by Epictetus, right, directly from Chrysippus. Is not particularly interested in exploring the physics or the logos, but is concerned with developing the practical implications in human existence of this threefold development. And then in the context of that threefold development, he has threefold way that it applies itself in our daily life. Right? The physics part is in terms of how we must relate to our desires. Right? We call the three topics or the three principles of decision. How we are to relate to our desires. Right? Number two, the action part, how we are to act as a function of those desires, right? And the third is how we are to understand or interpret. That's the rational part, right? And the key thing is to separate out our instinctual responses or our cultural responses to an event, an occurrence, and to separate out what is actually occurring and what is the interpretation that we have been trained to give to it, and to free ourselves from that enculturated interpretation that why is that a bad thing, for example? We say it's a bad thing, right? Is it in our power or not? Will it compromise our capacity to fulfill our nature or not? Right? So I want to show you the way Marcus seeks to apply that. This may not do justice full to Epictetus, but what I'm trying to see here is Epictetus takes over the Chrysippus worldview and seeks really to focus only on the ethical portion, primarily the behavioral portion, right? But apply it with those three dimensions. Nature at work is our desires, what our body moves and desires, and how we can get control of that so we are not victimized by our desires, but they become simply our capacity to control and desire only that which is in our power and not to desire that which is not in our power. Number two, that we do not act out of spontaneousness or out of irrationality, but we act only in such a way as it is a function of our choice of what we wish to do, and we do so based on an adequate, the third part, an adequate understanding of what is truly in our power and what is not in our power, so that it's perfectly okay for us to desire to look forward to wealth, health, riches, fame, but to recognize that those are what they often call preferred indifference. They're indifferent because we don't need them to live well. And they are not in our power. We cannot control our reputation. We can control what we choose to do, but we cannot control how people respond to us. If we worry about that, we are becoming slaves, is the word they actually use. We are turning our power over to others. We are becoming enslaved, and we are not fulfilling our capacity. Right? It's fine to aim at a target. Doesn't matter whether you hit it or not, as long as you shoot well. Intention is central here. Intention is central to evaluating the quality of your life. But it's an interesting distinction, by the way, if you think about it in terms of the relation between consequentialism and deontological ethics. Yeah. In a court of law, it's not so much the consequences as the intention. What did you try to do? What was your intention? Did you really try to kill that person, or was it the consequence may be the person was killed, but the intention may have been different, and different circumstances may have intervened that you had no control over. Are you responsible for those circumstances that were not in your control? Now, should you have known about them, then you have some responsibility. But if there's no way you could have known that, let's say the building was going to fall, then you're not responsible. Right? So in a court of law, you basically evaluate the intention of the person, what they know and what they had a right to know, what they were, you might say, expected to know. So, you say ignorance of the law is no excuse. There are things you should know, and if you didn't know, then your intention was failing. But you're judged by the judges should be judging you on your character and your intention, not the consequences, except to the extent to which you should have known and anticipated the consequences. Now, if you're in legislator, it's quite the reverse. The legislator can or not pay any attention to the intention. The job of the legislator is essentially to write laws which direct consequences, right? By either providing the appropriate intentions for people or inducements or whatever. I mean, oversimplifying, but basically this is correct. Basically, legislators are concerned with legislating for consequences, and judges are essentially concerned with evaluating intention. Yeah.
But as soon as you introduce a law,
Yeah.
individuality.
No, why do you say that? Why would you say, again, rephrasing, you're saying as soon as you introduce a law, individuality is taken out of the equation. And I say, why do you say that?
Well, because you're governed by laws, and you would hope that those laws are in your best interest.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're not, you still have to obey them because there's consequences involved. And the laws change, as we all know, as time goes on. If I want to walk across the street against the traffic light, I have a right to do that. But the law says I can get a ticket, and
What do you
by bus.
you said if you walk across the street against the traffic light, you have a right to do it, but the law says you don't. But I'm not sure what kind of right you have. You have the capacity to do that, but I don't know if that gives you the right. Where do you get the right from? Now the question is, where are you getting that right from? And to get a right, it's got to come from some moral framework. Right? And then that's the question. From the point of view of, oversimplifying here a little bit, but from the point of view of the Stoics, you don't have a right. Your duty is to respect your collective obligation to the well-being of humanity, right? Unless you can show that in some sense, the actual operative law is at odds with the natural law. And that would be the basis then of rejecting the positive law. And then the question is, what's the appropriate way to reject that positive law? Is it just to violate it? And that's one of the civil disobedience questions. Usually you violate the law publicly, preparing to accept the consequences supposedly in order to bring moral attention to the fact that the law is inconsistent with a higher law. I mean, that's an interpretation of one way of understanding civil disobedience. All right. So the question is, where does the right come from? Now, from the Stoics, the right comes from the logos, the logos of the physis of nature, the providential structure. And we'll see that with I wanted to read to you. I thought the best way to conclude our discussion was some excerpts from Marcus Aurelius. So what Marcus does, he's not a great creative philosopher. I have great respect for him, but right, basically, if Epictetus is an application of the Chrysippus worldview, I think it is, to the practical problems of daily living, Marcus is a manual struggling to get him to train himself to act as Epictetus says he should. So Marcus, I mean, it's fascinating. In some sense, you have the emperor of the Roman Empire, emperor, you know, every day speaking to himself and saying, this is what he says. We'll start with this is book 2, right? Just be, you know, it's not organized in a systematic fashion because he was not writing this for publication. Not like Seneca, for example. If you want to get a sense of Seneca, read his essay on anger. Seneca is very much of a popular writing, trying to advise people on how do you deal with specific emotions, most particularly anger, how to get control of them, and not to be the slave of anger and its destructive consequences, but to be in control of them. All right, that's an oversimplification, but that'll do it for Seneca. But here, so Marcus says, I think it's just fascinating. Remember, he's writing to himself. I mean, no one's supposed to be reading this, right? Right? So he says, say to yourself in the morning, I shall meet people who are interfering, ungracious, insolent, full of guile, deceitful, and antisocial. I'm sure he meant many of them. They have all become like that because they have no understanding of good and evil. But I, who have contemplated the essential beauty of good and the essential ugliness of evil, and know what the nature of the wrongdoer is of one kin with mine, that's right, we're all one human being, right? Not indeed of the same blood or seed, but sharing the same mind, the same portion of the divine, right? So we said, like logos, in me, in you, it's divine, it's the divine in each of us, right? I cannot be harmed by any one of them, and no one can involve me in shame. I cannot feel anger against him who is of my kin, nor hate him. We were born to labor together. We're common humanity. Like the feet, the hands, the eyes, and the rows of upper and lower teeth. It's one body, right? The sense of the image of Stoics is really, it's one body of humanity. To work against one another is therefore contrary to nature. And to be angry against a man or turn one's back on him is to work against him. All right. So then he says, you know, it's I have a bunch that could go on for another hour or two here. I love Marcus, but
How
yeah.
did he do?
Huh?
How well did he do?
Well, how well? You mean in terms of consequences?
In terms of adhering to his own.
Well, you know, we don't have a great deal of sources about detail about the personal lives. He certainly made one disastrous decision. I mentioned that last time. Rather than adopting the best possible person as his son to be then the ruler following him, he chose his own son to be the ruler following him. And his son was a sadistic monster, to say the least. He was at least, Commodus was at the level of Nero and Caligula, an absolute disaster, okay? What would have happened to the Roman Empire had he chosen someone as, you know, like himself or like the people, the 4 emperors that preceded him, the so-called 5 great good emperors, and the so-called period of the Pax Romana from 96 of the Common Era to 180, which was basically a period of peace and well-being in the Roman, more or less. Who knows what would have happened? We cannot do counterfactual history, you know. So that was a vast mistake, okay? But beyond that, poor Marcus found himself in a situation where in the middle of his reign, the Roman Empire suffered the scourge of the plague. Now, no one understood what the plague was. The plague kept coming and going for years, and until, of course, the Great Plague of 1348, which wiped out, half of more than half of Siena and a third or so of Florence, and etc. And we went through COVID, and it was nothing compared to this. And we know the problem here. We got, a third or half of towns killed, and people not knowing what it was, right? But the plagues were coming and going. Well, and he confronted that in the middle of his empire. So he had to deal with plague, really attacking his armed forces, for example. Many people killed, right? At the same time, he had to deal with continual barbarian invasions with an army that was seriously impeded by the plague. He was out in the field much of the last 10 years or so of his reign, on the field, leading his troops against the, fighting off the barbarian invasions coming from the north. Not where he wanted to be, but he had to be there. He talks, these notes were written in some part while he's out in the field. So it's difficult to evaluate. I don't know enough. I really don't know enough about the time, etc. Internally, of course, he has a bad reputation among Christians, because there were some Christians who were put to death in this period of time. Well, they were seen as ones they would not respect the emperor and the official religion, and they were basically seditious from the point of view of the emperor, right? And all they were asking is, it's like, say, go to the temple, make your thing and go and do whatever you want. There was no effort to persecute them systematically, but if they refused to show allegiance, right? So he has certainly has a bad history in the Christian tradition, right? But there was no persecutions. There was an effort to try and maintain the empire on a day-to-day basis, and it had functioned fairly well for 100 years, since roughly 96, right? I am not a sufficient knowledgeable to make a more sophisticated evaluation of Marcus as an emperor or the conditions at the time. And I must admit, I have never read Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which basically deals with the 3rd century and beyond. But again, Commodius is a good beginning of that 3rd century. It was a disaster. But this is Marcus. And he says, the works of the gods are full of providence. The works of chance are not divorced from nature or from the spinning and weaving together of those things which are governed by providence. Thence everything flows. There is also necessity in what is beneficial to the whole ordered universe of which you are part. You meaning himself, talking to himself, right? That which is brought by the nature of the whole and preserves it is good for every part. So he has no sense that there could be, maybe it's a little overly simplistic, that there could be any conflict between what's good for the cosmos and what's good for the individual. Well, we could think of, I guess one could think in terms of ethical questions, how something might be good for the country or for the nation or for the universe or whatever, and not be as good for you or me or any small group. But from Marcus, they're all one seamless whole, and that's very Chrysipian, if I may say so. And he goes on. Firmly, as a Roman and a man should, think at all times, again, he's talking to himself. You just have to think, he's not giving you lessons, he's talking to himself, because it's only for him. Think at all times how you can perform the task at hand with precise and genuine dignity, sympathy, independence, and justice, making yourself free from all other preoccupations. This you will achieve if you perform every action as if it was the last of your life. If you rid yourself of all aimless thoughts, of all emotional opposition to the dictates of reason, means of the logos, of all pretense, selfishness, and displeasure with your lot. And that notion of do not, it's Epicurus who says, Epictetus who says, do not wish the world to be other than it is, right? But rather wish to want the world to be as it is. And Epictetus talks about the fact that we should see God as the giver of the world and life, and that our life is a gift. Now, it gets pretty extreme with Epicurus. I mean, I'll get this one. I mean, I always have trouble with this part of it, but they show Epictetus, I mean. Epictetus takes this notion of it as a gift quite to as far as you can. Yeah, here's the line. I have it right here. This is Epictetus. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have tranquil flow of life. And he says, different place, never say about anything, I have lost it, but say, I have restored it. Is your child dead? It has been restored. Is your wife dead? She has been restored. Now, I have trouble with that, I must say, but the point is that that life is a gift. Our life is a gift. We do not choose when we're born, with what abilities and skills, to what parents, right? To what, with what language and what culture and any of that stuff. What the existentialist Martin Heidegger calls the thrownness of the human condition, right? Right? We find ourselves, right? We didn't choose it. We had no option on it. It's given to us, right? Treasure it, but you have no right to it, right? Accept it. Don't bemoan it. Cherish it, as it were. But focus only on that which is in your own power, or you'll be torn apart by your hopes and aspirations. You want to own things, the anxiety and to own, the struggle to possess. And then you've got it, and the anxiety and struggle to maintain it, to keep it, to protect it, right? It's okay to have it. They talk about, what are things essential? There's that Serenity Prayer of Reinhold Niebuhr does catch a lot of this stuff, right? About knowing what's in your power, what's not, and the wisdom's know the difference, right? So the vast majority of things are really not good or bad intrinsically. What's good is what you freely choose to do in accordance with your nature. What's bad is what you do that's contrary to your nature, which tears you apart. And the rest is indifferent. Now, but there are differences among indifference. There are preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference. Wealth, reputation, power, perhaps, health, certainly. These are all preferred indifference, right? I mean, and the Stoics recognize that, and there's a discussion within the Stoics. It's not a cult in which you have this line set down. I mean, they argue, well, if they're preferred and dispreferred, there must be a reason or a rationale or a criteria which determines what constitutes a preferred indifferent versus an unpreferred indifferent or a dispreferred indifferent, and you can discuss that and what criteria and under what condition. But don't get it out of control. So it's fine. Yeah, health is great. They said one place says, health is great. It's up to you to choose your doctor, but it's not up to you to control the consequences of your treatment. The doctor is the expertise. The doctor engages in treatment. You can make a choice that you can research it. You can try and figure out what the best doctor is. You can try and understand whatever you can do. At some point, that's what you can do, but you can't control your body. You can't control how it interacts with the natural world. You can't control the environment in which you find yourself. Right? You certainly can't control the doctor, his expertise or her expertise. I must say, by the way, just as a little aside, I went to a doctor this morning. I was an MRI, and I had a follow up on this MRI. I went to see a doctor. I was directed to see a doctor. It was the most beautiful doctor I've ever encountered in my life. Unfortunately, there was no problem, which is great too. But I was just with she and her two assistants, three beautiful women come into this room. I said, "Well, I'm too old for all this stuff," but she was very. But fortunately, all was well.
I hope you were stoic in
Huh?
that situation.
Yeah, I was certainly very stoic. I was preparing. I was, like Marcus. I was practicing and going through the ritual. But so I mean, this notion then of gift is really central for Epictetus. Right? Well, what Marcus is doing, and I just try to make it simply. You have Chrysippus theory. Epictetus applies it to daily life in a very practical way, and Marcus is a manual seeking to apply Epictetus's thought, and he knew Epictetus's thought. He knew it well. He refers to it many times, and he's trying to train himself. Right? This is not something that just happens because you read something, right? Any more than you can, fix the automobile because you read the manual. You've got to practice, and you've got to practice. You've got to develop the habits and the mode of thinking and the capacity and sensitivity to actually mold your character and your behavior to be coherent with what Logos tells you your nature is, so that you do this as almost second nature, right? Let's see. Page 30. What's next one? On the same theme here. Everything which is in tune with you, O universe, is in tune with me. Nothing which happens at the right time for you is early or late for me. Everything, O nature, which your seasons produce is fruit to me. All things come from you, exist in you, and will return to you. If he could say, beloved city of Cecrops, will you not say, beloved city of Zeus? And the last part for this, on Providence, page 75. I tried to organize some of these. Here. Every nature is satisfied when it travels the right road. And a nature endowed with reason travels the right road if, in its imaginings, it does not assent to what is false or what is obscure. That's the third of the assent is the third of the three disciplines of Epictetus. It does not assent to what is false or what is obscure. It directs its impulses. That's the first discipline of Epictetus, on desire. If it directs its impulses on a straight path, which leads only to social actions, if it limits its desires and aversions to what is within our power, that's the second discipline. There are three of them for Epictetus: on desire, on action, on belief. To be each one of them to be for us rationally to control our decisions and our commitments. So if I go say that again, every nature is satisfied when it travels the right road, and a nature endowed with reason travels the right road if, in its imagining, it does not assent to what is false or what is obscure. If it directs its impulses on the straight path, which leads only to social actions, if it limits its desires and aversions to what is within our power and welcomes whatever is allotted to it by the common nature. That's the comprehensive, that's Marcus's sense of piety. To love the cosmos and to love one's place in it. And this leads one, you know, and Epictetus talks a lot about this notion of, say, well, what is my place? What is my obligation? What is my duty? Right? He says, well, what is your name? The name, in the sense of your social place, your father, a son, a daughter, a mother, a sister, a brother, a citizen, a subject. Though that name, those names carry with them obligations, duties, responsibilities. Fulfill your place. Do what you are supposed to do. If I can find Epictetus on, I think I have it here. Where's that? Oh, yeah, here's one. Yeah, you just get an example. He is your father. This means that you are called upon to take care of him, give way to him in all things, bear with him if he reviles or strikes you. But he is a bad father. Well, have you any natural claim to a good father? No, only to a father. That's it. Oh, he says another one. Epictetus says that this happens because we forget what name we have: son, brother, counselor. For each of these names, if rightly considered, always points to the acts appropriate to it. What this reminded me of, by the way, is what is central to Confucianism, what is often called the rectification of names. Confucius' strategy for achieving social peace during the bloody war times that he happened to live in. And what was central was what he called the rectification of names. If rulers will be rulers and subjects will be subjects, but that means, what does it mean to be a true ruler? To put primary concern on taking care of and looking after the well-being of your subjects. And if, and what does it mean to be a true subject? To respect the dignity and position of the ruler and to do as the good ruler demands and requests you to do. So the rectification of names is really central to Confucian ethics and social theory, you might say. And in some sense, Epictetus is saying something very similar. And Marcus is simply trying to say, all right, what does it mean for me to be a good emperor? But understanding that the emperor position is a role in a cosmos, but the wider obligation is to be a human being, a rational being in a community of rational beings. So I think we sort of, well, maybe I'll have one last, statement here from Marcus. No nature is inferior to art. Indeed, the arts imitate the nature of things. If so, then the most perfect and comprehensive nature of all could not be inferior to artistic skill. All arts, at any rate, produce the lower for the sake of the higher, and so surely does nature. Externals, whose pursuit or avoidance disturbs you, do not impose themselves on you, but in a sense, you yourselves go out to them. At any rate, let your judgment be calm, and they will remain still, and you will not be seen to either pursue or avoid them. Someone despises me. That is his concern. My concern is that I be not found to do or say anything which deserves to be despised. He will hate me. That is his concern. But I am kind and friendly to everyone, and ready to point out to this very man where he went wrong, not reproachfully, not not reproachfully, nor to show off my forbearance, but genuinely and to benefit him. And finally, to live the good life to the end. The power to do this is in the soul. If a man is indifferent to things of no importance, if he will so remain if he examines each of these things, both by analyzing it in its parts and as a whole, and remembers that not one of them creates a judgment about itself in us, nor does it force itself upon us. It's us who make the judgments. The external things remain still. It is we who make judgments about them, and as it were, inscribe them upon our minds, though we need not so inscribe them. That is in our power. Well, I'll leave it at that for today. I trust that you have some sense of the Stoics, and there is a tremendous effort now to apply the Stoic thoughts to contemporary experience. That obviously cannot be done by also applying the Stoic metaphysics, right? So the modern Stoics take over this sense of what it means to be in control of your own life with respect to, I think, the Epictetus's notion of controlling one's desires and aversions, controlling one's actions and engagements, and controlling one's interpretations of events as to what is good or bad, what is within our power and what is not. But it does not usually involve any assumption of a providential order, right? And it is probably ambiguous or agnostic, let me say, about not only the providential order, but even about questions of the relation between the material structure of the world and the operation of the human mind. Right? What it does emphasize and put central is the extent to which our mind determines the meaning and significance of events that we encounter. Events do not come with their own meaning. I mean, they come, in some sense, they do come with their own, and insofar as we're socialized creatures in this world, we have been brought up and civilized, and that means cultivated, and that means acculturated to interpret the world basically the way other people that we live with interpret the world. But that interpretation is quite different from the actual engagements. Right? It is a social interpretation which you've internalized, so we do pretty naturally, right? And then we respond to the events as we have been acculturated to interpret them. But we can cut that off. We can separate out the event that happens from the acculturated and internalized and unthinking, as it were, interpretation, and therefore free us from that interpretation as guiding our sense of its significance and its importance for us. And then that self-critical examination of what it is that matters to us and what we wish to do about it frees us up from being, as it were, the prisoners or the slaves, as they would say here, right, of the acculturated interpretation of the meaning and significance of whatever event it is, which was not in our power in the first place. So I think the modern Stoics really explore that and do some interesting things. And let me say as a last word, this is a sort of a private plug for one of my friends and my common compatriots at the Ethical Society will know of her. And I'm referring to Anitra, who she had a blog on Stoicism. It's actually quite good. And you can find it, and I'll suggest to you, because it's very nice, practical application of Stoicism to contemporary moral issues. I think she does an excellent job. And it's, where I did write down, it's a blog in, where did I write it? It's Oh, darn it, now I'm annoyed with myself. I wrote it down. Oh, yeah, here it is. 3quarksdaily.com. It's a blog, I guess, that people write for. So it's just the number 3, quarks, QUARKSDAILY, daily, 3quarksdaily.com. And I guess a lot of people write for it, right? She had one particularly on Chrysippus, which I just read before, which I thought was really quite nice. Short, they're short. This one she did, it was Chrysippus on impressions, cognition, and knowledge, September 9th, 2019. I just happened to read that one. So anyway, you might find it interesting to look at because it is really quite accessible. I told her, I said, you really should put these in. It's a very nice, it could be a nice little book, and by little, you know, page and a half or 2 pages on different issues like that. Nicely written, explained, and totally consistent. Anyway, 3 Quarks Daily, and her name is Anitra. It's an unusual name, Anitra Tadliko. You might find it extremely interesting, but there are a lot of very famous people out there. She comments on some of them, but anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.